So this is the last one in our series. Made it. We've got to the end. Well done, everybody. And I go back to what somebody said to me some weeks ago when I was saying, well, have any of you ever had a series on Lamentations before? And they said, oh, no. And there's probably a reason why. But we've reached the end of the book. We've landed on the last page. And that desire, I suspect, which is in many of us when we're reading a book, there's this little bit within us that just wants to go to the final page. We just want to see what the conclusion is. We just want to see what the happy ever after is. But of course, that may not be true. And for those of you that have turned up and go, oh my goodness, Lamentations, we must come up with something else to do on a Sunday morning. These series of poems, they are written in the context of the destruction of Jerusalem about 580 BC. And when I say destruction, I mean utter destruction. You would have got a hint of what that destruction was in the passages that have just been read to us by Joe. But in chapter 5, there are a number of subtle literary alterations in this chapter, which we don't get in the first 4 chapters. You'll remember that in chapters 1, 2, 3, 4, there's this acrostic. So it's A, B, C, and each sentence begins with the next letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And we've all become experts at the Hebrew alphabet as translated into English. That hasn't worked particularly well. But what we have in chapter 5 are shorter, mixed up sentences. The acrostic is not there any longer. And I think this is possibly an indication of a couple of things. But first of all, the author probably has just run out of energy. And if you think back, you've got the examples of almost being a war reporter, talking about what he saw, explaining what was going on around. And there was this actually in chapter 3, I think, actually, this is affecting me. This is affecting me as well. And I think the author has just run out of energy. But I think also there's this very, very stylized series of poems. I think there's also something here about the disorder. So in chapters 1, 2, 3, 4, you had this order, A, B, C, D in chapter 3, AAB, AAA, BBB, CCC. You don't have that in chapter 5. And I wonder if the author's making the point that actually when it comes to pain, when it comes to suffering, there is disorder. It is all over the place. It is messy. I really enjoy Only Fools and Horses, and many of you, I'm sure, like Only Fools and Horses as well. It's celebrating its 40th birthday this year. This week, actually, I think it's this week or within the last couple of weeks. And yesterday we watched one of the final episodes, which was Time on Their Hands. And you have this sick couple of scenes where Del Boy and Rodney, and I won't go into Only Fools and Horses for those of you who haven't seen it, where have you been? But Del Boy and Rodney are in a lift shaft. The lift has broken down, and Del has this conversation with Rodney, his brother, over a miscarriage that Rodney's wife has just suffered. And you have this really beautifully written, poignantly written series of scripts between Del Boy and Rodney, John Sullivan, a superb writer. And you have this moment of pain and this anguish and that moment, and we are watching that. And then the scene cuts, and it goes back to the flat. And in the flat, they've just had some furniture delivered because they're having a posh meal that evening. And the furniture that's been delivered has got to go back to the town hall a couple of days later because it is the actual town hall furniture that they have in the town hall meetings. And you have that moment of laughter that just breaks in to that very, very poignant time in the lift shaft. And so there's something here that says, actually, when we're talking about pain and suffering, it is disordered. It is all over the shop. There's no one right way of doing it and experiencing it. Secondly, here, there's a sense that these verses are directed towards God. And perhaps even maybe for the first time, a hint of prayer. Remember, O Lord, what has happened to us. Look and see our disgrace. In verse 1, there's this effort almost of trying to introduce community prayer. Remember us, bring us to mind, Lord. And it's almost as if the author's trying to get almost from a standing start, or from the debris that lies around, a sustained act of prayer from those that are left in the destroyed city of Jerusalem. And one other thing about these verses is that the language feels as if it is written at a slightly later time. So rather than saying this is what's going on now, this is what's happening around, we're seeing this going on now, the language alters just a little. So, for example, in verse 2, our inheritance has been turned over to aliens. There's a sense that something that started in the past, but it still continues, but started at some time ago. I think they call that the... Nikki doesn't know, boys and girls. Nikki doesn't know. So, but there's certainly a hint here of time having moved on. Because time is a great healer, isn't it? Or perhaps more realistically, time allows us to adapt to the circumstances within which we find ourselves. And I've really appreciated the comments on the door over the last few weeks as services have finished, as we've gone through this book. Comments which have shaped the following weeks in many ways, as people have made an observation about something that was pertinent to them in the context of this exploration of lament. Just last week, someone said, what the lowest common denominator of suffering is? No, I'm no good to have on a quiz team. Sorry. And the person said, and I think this is probably quoting from Martin Luther when I looked it up this week, but the lowest common denominator of suffering is here I stand, do no other. Here I stand, I can do no other, because that's it, isn't it? We have these times in our life where we are battered from all angles, and all we can do, just about, is to stand. The opening verses of Lamentations speak about the reversal of fortunes that the people experienced. Our inheritance over to strangers, our homes to foreigners. We have become fatherless, our mothers are widows. We must buy the water we drink, the wood can only be had at a price. And think about some of the language that is used here, the inheritance, which was the promised land, the inheritance that God's chosen people would have is this promised land. But this land is now home to outsiders. The God of their fathers has ostensibly left them, and they are fatherless and the promised land in which they find themselves, which was flowing with milk and honey, now has people needing to buy water to drink. The chosen people of God became the widows and the orphans and the strangers and the foreigners that they were told to care for. How things have altered. But it's at the end of the chapter that I want to spend a few moments on this morning. And it's at the end of the chapter that I think we begin change in this book. And in verse 19, you, Lord, reign forever. Your throne endures from generation to generation. But why do you forget us? Why do you forsake us for so long? And I think it's here that we find the collision of what many of us experience when we're in the eye of the storm. You, Lord, reign forever. Your throne endures from generation to generation. Why do you always forget us? Why do you always forsake us for so long? You have this collision. You have this collision of faith on the one hand, but protest on the other. You reign forever, but why do you forget us? And what I think the author is saying here is that God is the one to whom you can bring your pain and your protest, but also to your prayer. We have a hint here, and I think it's nothing more than a hint, but we have a hint here of people looking to God once again. But for those of you that are familiar with your Old Testament history, you'll know that it's something like 100 to 150 years before the Israelites begin to return back to Jerusalem. And you may be familiar with stories such as involving the people such as Esther. That wonderful line in the book of Esther, maybe God just put you here for such a time as this. People such as Ezra, people like Nehemiah returning to Jerusalem to rebuild the walls, quite a famous Old Testament story. But you've got this period of silence of 100 or so years. But of course, the possible change in behavior of the people, maybe even the possible change in the author, is not the only change that we see when we look at the bigger picture of where Lamentations exists. And I just want to drop into Isaiah. I'm going to do that a couple of times in the next few moments. And Isaiah 65 has these really famous words, which I think you will resonate, or they'll echo somewhere in your mind. Isaiah 65:17. And Isaiah says, speaking of, see, I will create new heavens and a new earth. The former things will not be remembered, nor will they come to mind. Be glad and rejoice forever in what I will create. For I will create Jerusalem to be a delight and its people a joy. I will rejoice over Jerusalem and take delight in my people. The sound of weeping and of crying will be heard no more. And thinking about change, thinking about what's different, that passage is reflected in many ways at the end of the Bible in Revelation 21. And in Revelation 21, it says, then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down from heaven, from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. The passage from Isaiah 65, verse 17, and the passage from Revelation 21, from verse 21, are very similar, but they're also very different. I think they provide a really good distinction between the people at the time of Lamentations and those of us here today. God's plan from day one was that he would be the God of the people that he created. They will be his people, and God himself will be their God. If you've got a bit of time this week, just as a little footnote, go back to chapter 4 and just look at the references to my people and the sort of the link that the author's perhaps making and saying that there's something there about God being their people, but that not quite working. There's an interesting connection there. That's in chapter 4. We didn't have enough time last week. But in the Old Testament, things were hard going. People fell away. People did their own thing. God was silent. The end of Lamentations, at least 100 years of silence. You have this wonderful passage. Wonderful is not the right word. You have this passage in Ezekiel, I think it's Ezekiel 10, Ezekiel 11, where the glory of God departs the temple. And it's as if the God just hovers over the doorframe and then drifts away. 400 years of silence from the end of Malachi to the angel appearing to Elizabeth in the New Testament. And the promise that the in the Old Testament had was that there'd be no more crying and there'd be no more weeping. But fast forward to Revelation. And that promise is not only built upon, it is also expanded. They will be his God, they will be his people, and God will be their God. And again, there'll be no more crying and there'll be no more weeping. But in addition, in Revelation, it says there'll be no more death, there'll be no more mourning, and there'll be no more pain. There'll be no more suffering. Suffering will end. Death and mourning will end. Do you have this difference? You have this difference of the promise in the Old Testament about no more crying, no more weeping. And in the New Testament, no more pain, no more mourning, no more sorrow as well. The difference and the reason for this difference and the rationale for this difference is, of course, Jesus. God himself taking on human form. God himself taking on human form and experiencing life as we do. Taking on the illness, the suffering, the disease, the sin, the error, and the pain of the world as he hung on the cross. But crucially, rising again on the third day, so that all that he took to the cross was defeated. And that promise that we have in Revelation holds firm. There'll be no more crying, no more weeping, no more pain, no more mourning, no more death. But in our experience, and in those times that we have, and those times that we look back, and those times that many of you have shared either on the doorstep or elsewhere, that says, this is going on for me now, and this is really difficult for me now. I think the last couple of lines of the book really helpfully, I think, sum up where we often are in those situations. And it's that word maybe. Maybe. We're not sure, but maybe. In verse 21, restore us to yourself, Lord, that we may return. Renew our days as of old, unless you have utterly rejected us and you are angry with us before measure. It sounds like it's quite a negative leading out, but I think in the context of those couple of sentences, what I think the author is saying, we're clinging on to you, we want to look to you, we have faith in you, but maybe there's this thing that's gone wrong. Maybe we've just been cut off forever. We go through life with doubt and with pain and with suffering. Things don't go to plan. We question and we query as they did in Lamentations. But unlike the people in Lamentations, we know the end of the story. We know that it will be a happy ever after. We know that God will bring all things together under one head, even Christ. We know that the journey there will not be without its grief, its pain, its suffering, and its lament. But we know in the end that God wins. And in suffering, there is always that maybe, isn't there? There's always that maybe where we want to cling on to God, but maybe something else is going on, or maybe something is happening, or maybe something else is happening that we don't understand. I think Lamentation says that maybe is absolutely fine. If you have those maybes, that's absolutely fine. That's absolutely fine. In the bigger picture, in the bigger picture that God sees, and in the bigger picture that we will one day see, there won't be any maybe. The maybe will have been removed. Psalm 30, verse 5. For his anger only lasts a moment, but his favor lasts a lifetime. Weeping may remain for the night, but rejoicing comes in the morning. In other words, there might be pain in the night, but joy comes in the morning. My hope as we come into land, and I sort of mean that properly now as opposed to just going on for the next 5 weeks, my hope as I come into land is that the last few weeks have been helpful to us, providing us with that permission to wait in that Holy Saturday moment, at that gap between the pain of the pain and suffering of Good Friday and the resurrection of Easter Saturday, and being able to sit and wait in that time and not needing to rush to the end. Maybe it's about finding our voice and perhaps express our anger not only at God but to God. The recognition in chapter 3, the twist in chapter 3, that what we've heard was actually affecting the author themselves. To recognize, this is always tricky, forgive me, to recognize that we aren't God, and that suffering isn't part of what we should be, but to remove the concept and lived experience for so many would mean that whatever that something better is that God had in mind could not be. We've reflected on the peaks and the troughs of life, recognizing that suffering and a loving God coexist, perhaps in the same way that the oceans and continents exist. And those very, very simple words in chapter 3. Yet this I call to mind. Yet this I call to mind. And in the midst of suffering and struggle, it's not about worshipping God to try and paper over the cracks or try and paint over the damp wall, but just reflect on what God has done before, which maybe may help in altering the perspective. Crucially, and ultimately, lament is missional. The book is a summons to remember the reality endured by people today. It keeps us focused on the world and provides an impetus to cry out to God in prayer. Never ever say that you're just praying. Prayer is the most valuable weapon that we have in a crying, hurting, and suffering world. Prayer is a tiny reflex that flexes the muscles of omnipotence. And it is done in the context of us being a people that know the last page. And it's not a glib phrase. But as I finish, know that we exist in the knowledge that because of one person, it will be okay in the end. Amen. Come, Lord Jesus.